Life as a doctor used to have a comforting routine. I was accustomed to my regular hospital shifts and gym workouts. But then the pandemic hit, and everything changed. The hospital became a chaotic battleground. I saw patients, including colleagues and familiar faces from the hospital canteen, fall victim to the virus. Small mistakes, like forgetting proper sanitation, began to feel like significant risks to my health and that of my patients. Struggling with the mounting pressure, I requested a transfer to a less critical area to help me regain my focus. My supervisor agreed, but due to severe staff shortages, I was assigned to the emergency room, handling both regular rounds and emergency cases. I decided to embrace the new responsibilities, hoping they would provide a chance to reset. One Friday night, as I prepared to go out, an urgent call changed my plans. There had been a major accident involving the mayor's daughter, a 24-year-old with severe injuries. I immediately shifted gears and worked through the night to stabilize her. Despite my exhaustion, I managed to ensure her safety before heading home. The following week, I monitored her recovery closely. Despite the strict no-visitor policy she found ways to communicate with me regularly. Initially, her conversations were a welcome distraction from the stress, but soon they turned flirtatious. Her advances made me uncomfortable, and the growing gossip among the staff about her behavior only added to my unease. I started avoiding the canteen to escape the awkward conversations. On a particularly hot day, during a routine check, she complained of shoulder pain. As I examined her, she pulled down her gown, revealing more than necessary. I struggled to maintain professionalism as she insisted on a closer look and touched me inappropriately. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I decided to leave. Her rude and unsettling remark as I left made me feel even worse. Seeking support, I confided in a colleague about her behavior. His response was shocking. He made crude jokes and suggested I should have taken advantage of the situation. His dismissive attitude left me feeling more isolated and distressed. I realized that remaining in this environment would only worsen my mental health, so I chose to return to my regular duties to avoid further complications. A week later, she was readmitted with mild symptoms. Her father used his influence to secure her a private room and special treatment, even though the hospital was overwhelmed with critical cases. This preferential treatment felt deeply wrong, as it seemed unjust to prioritize her care over others who were suffering. When I checked on her this time, fully covered in PPE, she initially didn't recognize me. When she did, her reaction was unsettling. Her smile was unnaturally wide, and her eyes were glassy and feverish. She gripped my suit tightly and scratched at the fabric. Her incoherent and inappropriate remarks made the situation increasingly disturbing. I completed the examination as quickly as possible and left the room, feeling anxious. After reporting the incident to hospital management, my concerns were dismissed. They claimed to have bigger problems to handle, leaving me feeling abandoned and unheard. Their indifference worsened my sense of isolation and urgency. I realized staying in this environment was detrimental to my mental health, so I made the difficult decision to resign for my own peace of mind. Months into my new job at a hospital in another state, I still grapple with guilt. Some people have questioned my decisions and even assumed my sexual orientation based on my discomfort in certain situations. It's frustrating because it's crucial to recognize that men can also experience harassment, and our feelings are often overlooked. In quiet moments, I still shiver. I can't shake the feeling that something from that hospital remains with me. The memories of her disturbing behavior and the hospital's lack of concern continue to haunt me. A stark reminder that some threats are not just external, but can also exist within our minds. This experience has left a lasting impact, highlighting the unseen challenges faced by those committed to helping others during difficult times. In November 2020, I found myself back in the hospital for the 8th time due to testicular torsion. It was incredibly frustrating because it felt like the doctors were only offering temporary fixes instead of solving the problem permanently. After my latest hospital visit, I called for a taxi. Given it was a busy Saturday night, I knew the taxi would take about 30 to 40 minutes to arrive. With such a long wait ahead, I decided to sit on a bench in the small garden area outside the hospital. It was around 3 a.m. The temperature was just above freezing, and I had been awake for over 36 hours. I settled cross-legged on the bench, put on my headphones, and lit a cigarette to stay awake while waiting for my ride. Everything seemed normal for the first 10 minutes, but then I noticed a man staggering toward me. His unsteady gait suggested he might be drunk, so I didn't think much of it. When he reached the bench, he stopped directly in front of me and mumbled something that I couldn't catch. I took off my headphones and looked up. The man's intense gaze made me uneasy as he said he could really hurt me right then and there. Caught completely off guard, I tried to stay calm and diffuse the situation with a light-hearted comment, which seemed to ease the tension a little. However, the man continued to make unsettling threats, hinting at a desire to fight. Eventually, his anger seemed to fade and he sat down on the bench next to me. His rambling turned into a disjointed monologue about his family, his friends, and a troubling affair he was having with his best friend's girlfriend. The conversation was uncomfortable, but I tried to stay polite. Then the man's attention shifted to my shoes. He pointed them out and asked if he could have them. I firmly declined but remained polite. He then asked if he could touch them, which raised a major red flag for me. I said no, but he began to rub my shoe anyway. Without warning, the man grabbed my ankle, lifted my leg, and placed the toe of my size 11 Converse sneaker in his mouth. I was stunned and felt a surge of panic. Desperate for help, I looked around and spotted a hospital security officer approaching. The officer checked to see if we knew each other. The man said yes, while I said no. The officer then asked if the man was a patient, and I said I wasn't sure but didn't think so. The man mumbled incoherently, and after a brief discussion, the officer advised him to leave. The man got up, shook my hand, and walked off into the night. The officer made sure I was okay, and I recounted the bizarre encounter. The officer seemed just as confused as I was. My taxi arrived a few minutes later, and I moved to the designated taxi rank on the other side of the hospital. Later, I shared the strange incident with some friends who were knowledgeable about various substances. They speculated that the man was likely on meth, and the peculiar behavior with my shoes might have been a personal quirk. I found myself in a deep, dark place one night, overwhelmed by a sense of hopelessness and despair. I took every medication in the house, hoping to end it all. Hours later, a friend found me on the floor, barely conscious, and immediately called for help. An ambulance rushed me to the nearest hospital. In the ER, I was completely out of it, with a few family members and a doctor standing by. One of my sisters worked at this small-town hospital as a CNA. She had a reputation for being a bit of a know-it-all, always demanding attention. She was off duty, but came to the ER and mentioned to the doctor that she worked there too. The hospital had its own little hierarchy. The dietary staff, like me, were at the bottom, CNAs were slightly higher up, nurses were in the middle, and doctors were at the top. The doctors often acted superior, and the nurses were frequently dismissive towards the dietary staff. My sister, in her bid to get closer to the doctor, was unwittingly involved in something disturbing. After I regained consciousness, I was placed in the psych ward for 48 hours, as mandated. One of my other sisters came to see me and shared something unsettling. She told me that the doctor in the ER had taken photos of me while I was unconscious. He claimed he liked my tattoos and intended to show them to my tattoo artist. It was highly unprofessional and made me feel profoundly violated. First, everyone in the medical field knows about patient confidentiality. Second, I had nearly died. The thought of a doctor taking photos of me in such a vulnerable state was beyond disturbing. I had spoken with this doctor the next day, and he never mentioned the photos. It was clear he had taken them for reasons other than professional interest. When I learned about this, I was furious. My CNA sister feared for her job but knew that allowing the doctor to take those photos was wrong. My mother advised me not to make a fuss because it might cost my sister her job. But I felt deeply violated. I was in the psych ward, surrounded by people with severe issues. One man was volatile and frightening. Another was a drug addict rambling incoherently, and yet another moaned in constant pain. Dealing with my own despair, the dismissive nurses, and feeling completely unsafe made everything worse. I reported the incident to the hospital but asked that my sister not face repercussions. A hospital representative came to talk to me, clearly more concerned about the hospital's reputation than my well-being. She said the doctor claimed he had deleted the photos. When I asked if she had seen him delete them, she couldn't provide a satisfactory answer. I knew that photos on an iPhone don't disappear completely after deletion. With no legal knowledge and no resources to hire a lawyer, I felt helpless. I worried that this incident wasn't an isolated one, and that other vulnerable patients might be exploited the same way. I left that hospital and never returned, wishing that a different doctor had been assigned to my case. After finishing my shift at the hospital around 8 p.m., I decided to walk home. It was getting dark, but I thought I'd be okay since there were still some streetlights and a bit of residual light from the setting sun. I usually listen to music on my iPod while I walk, even though I know it's not the best idea. As I was heading towards a bridge that crosses a busy road, I noticed a small wooded area on either side. Suddenly, I felt like someone was watching me. I stopped my music and looked around, but everything seemed normal. I figured maybe I was just being paranoid, so I kept walking with the music off. Not long after, I heard some rustling behind me. I turned around quickly but saw nothing. My heart was pounding, but I tried to stay calm. Once I reached the top of the bridge where everything was open and visible, I felt a bit better. By the time I got close to home, I was laughing at myself for being so jumpy. My music was back on, and I was relaxed, thinking about how silly I'd been. As I reached the top of a park that's right across from my street, I glanced behind me for no particular reason. That's when I noticed a guy just a few feet behind me. He was tall, skinny, and dressed in all black. His hair was greasy and hanging around his face. What really freaked me out was his expression. His eyes were empty, like there was nothing behind them. He was staring straight at me. I sped up, trying to stay calm. I thought about calling the police, but didn't want to slow myself down. I wasn't sure if I was just overreacting, but no matter how fast I walked, he stayed behind me, moving at the same speed. Every time I looked back, his blank stare was still fixed on me. I was terrified and just wanted to get home. When I finally reached my front door, I fumbled for my keys, knowing he could catch up any moment. I got inside and locked the door just as he was about 15 feet away. I ran upstairs as quickly as I could. Our front door has glass panels and the living room has big glass doors that face the back garden. I didn't want him to see me, so I was cautious as I moved. Shaking, I checked the window on the stairs. He wasn't in sight. I went to the bedroom window for a better look, and he was still gone. I thought maybe he had left, so I took out my phone to call the non-emergency number. But as soon as I walked back into the living room, I saw his face pressed against the glass. He was staring right at me with those lifeless eyes. I screamed and ran back upstairs, dialing the emergency number this time. The police arrived quickly and found him sitting cross-legged in my garden, still just staring at the house. They took him away without any fuss. An officer later told me he had said, "I was just waiting for her." I found out later that the guy was an inpatient at my hospital. He'd developed a fixation on me after seeing me at work. Some people I know from the psychiatric unit mentioned he'd been talking about his girlfriend, and they thought he meant another patient. Now they realize he was talking about me. He's been moved to a different hospital, and I hope he gets the help he needs. I'll definitely be taking the bus home from now on. When I was 19, I found myself in a dire situation. I had recently stopped taking my bipolar medication and was struggling with substance abuse after my first year of college. One night, everything unraveled, and I ended up in an adult psychiatric unit for the first time. Having only been in adolescent wards before, the facility was unsettling from the start. Patients were shuffled into rooms without any real introduction. The staff seemed distant, more interested in dispensing medication than offering genuine care. When I was shown to my room, I met my new roommate, a woman in her late 40s or early 50s, of Hispanic descent. She was taller than me and kept her eyes fixed on the floor. A cartoonish red devil tattoo peeked out from her sleeve. I chose to stay in my corner of the room, not wanting to provoke any interaction. The first night passed quietly, except for a group session that my roommate skipped. Later, while we were getting our medication, a disturbance erupted in the ward across the hall. Patients began banging on the glass doors. One man hit his head against the glass while others screamed and jumped around. The chaos was jarring and lingered even after the orderlies managed to calm things down. This was my first encounter with such extreme behavior in a psychiatric unit. The aggression and unpredictability made me feel deeply unsettled. I tried to settle down and sleep, but the anxiety kept me on edge. In the middle of the night, I found myself drifting in that strange state between wakefulness and sleep. A peculiar pressure on my forehead woke me, and I noticed something warm and damp on my face. When I managed to open my eyes, I saw my roommate standing over me. She stared at me with an unsettling intensity, one hand pressed against my forehead and the other clenched against her chest. Her eyes were vacant, and she muttered rapidly in a language I didn't recognize. Fear took hold, leaving me paralyzed. I had no idea what she might do next. The ward was eerily quiet except for our room. The nurse's station was far down the hall, and I felt utterly isolated. My roommate continued to wipe the sweat from my forehead, her muttering growing more frantic. Then she placed both hands on my forehead and started shaking me, her voice rising to a fevered scream. I felt trapped and helpless, unable to escape or defend myself. Just as I was about to lose control, a nurse arrived. The nurse seemed more annoyed than concerned as she pulled my roommate away and escorted her out of the room. She told me to try to sleep, but the fear lingered. Despite the lingering anxiety, I eventually managed to drift back into a restless sleep. The next morning, my roommate was gone. I assumed she had been moved to a different ward. Later that day, I was discharged and left the facility behind, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. That night has stayed with me, a haunting reminder of how unsettling things can become. The anxiety and trouble sleeping continued, and the experience left a lasting impression.